I really am cynical about the American educational experience right now, not just
Well,
because of
yeah,
a lot of other reasons. I think one of the main
right.
things is I see so many teachers who miss the forest for the trees. They think that the whole experience is about either getting into college or getting a good job or making sure that you get enough grades in the grade book or making sure that you overload kids with all this classical stuff they have to know. And what they don't
Hmm.
get, what they don't get is, I think, is that the majority of people, young people especially, are on the brink of despair half the time. They see very little
Yeah,
purpose. They don't know what the hell any of this is worth. And they'd much rather just spend their time with their friends playing video games than learning anything. And I don't blame them in
yep,
some. Um,
yeah.
with that magnitude of crisis, it's like you're rearranging deck chairs, Titanic or something. It's just, the hell are you doing? So
But and I think that's exactly it. And there are so many things right now where that's precisely what's going on. It's just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
And why would you do that? I mean, why in that kind of crisis? Why would you do that? I think, again, I'm very close to not throwing in the towel completely about things, but throwing in the towel about this idea about how it can save education. I just like the thing is so vastly off kilter. If it was ever on kilter, I don't even know if it was. I wonder if we maybe enjoyed. You and I grew up in an era where it was things were relatively hunky as well as dory in the economic and social sphere. So that
Right.
education as big a crisis yet. It was beginning to be, but it wasn't as big a crisis yet. And now it's
Yep.
just wow, just off, so off.
Like it's totally denuded. Before you could tolerate it, it wasn't, but now it's like the things. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's clearly no beef there. Before we were content with a fluffy bun, but now it's apparent there's
Well,
no beef.
and now you think, okay, do I continue to persist in my own small way here and there and try to affect some good? Or do I find myself in a completely different venue? Do I go to something else completely? It's and that's tough because for a guy like me, you probably sympathize. For a guy like me, it's very difficult to give up either the sense of calling that you're kind of called to teach other people, or else a
Yeah.
sense of feeling a tough. You go and drive a UPS truck, and the whole time you're like thinking about something completely different. It's a tough call.
So you were teaching coding.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is this is funded under or somehow what do you call, tucked in, dog-eared, earmarked into a bigger project about see, we're preparing the kids for a tech-savvy future by teaching them the rudiments of coding. I've seen this, so they're trying to pull that kind of thing in some of the Italian national standards now, preparing the kids to be good coders by that kind of exercise. It's that kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's where it was used to be like they'd have exercises about saving water so that not wasting water so we don't kill the rainforest, right? Like that was the big thing back in the day. You'd have little Pedro and Maria, I don't know, Maria Veronica something or other, the two characters in your math book, saving water and how much water did they save so that the rainforest could be whatever. I just remember that being a thing. Um, Now it's like they use coding, not just coding examples, but a lot of the exercises around this kind of thing. How can we convert everything into symbolic logic and make it, essentially ones and zeros? How to help them think more like a machine.
That's really
And
did you
that
bring
sounds like exactly what that is.
that's I had not thought of that before, Cameron. I think you're absolutely right. They may not express it that way, but I think that's precisely what's going on. I had thought when I got pissed off with the program, I had thought, well, I phrased it as they are emphasizing bureaucracy
Hmm.
over art of translating. Because as you and I know, when you have somebody who is a good translator, they're a good translator because they love the language and they get into it and they study the forms and they know it back and forth and they're fluid. They use the
Hmm.
words like falling off a rock or falling off a log.
Yeah.
Um, but that filling in of the symbols, especially the emphasis on it, is very similar to the filling in of the ovals on those little ACT tests. It's and
Yeah.
I've ACT and the PSAT and all those other bullshit tests, they aren't really about testing whether you have a knowledge. They're really testing about whether or not you're conforming to the rules and regulations. And it's more of a psychological conditioning, I think, than it is an actual test.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think you're right on that. I had not thought of that before. And maybe that's where my real objection came, was a larger objection that I see in the school generally and in the culture generally, of making individuals into cogs rather than making individuals flourish as human beings.
Yep.
The tricky thing about making individuals flourish as human beings is you normally come out with a small crop, a small yield, right? Of people that really love life and want to know more about being alive and about the universe. It's a small crop. That's why the liberal arts per se was always a sort of elitist thing, because it has only a small group of people that really latch onto it.
Yeah,
just
right.
Perfect. But the majority of people don't want to know that kind of stuff. They don't want to ask questions or probe deeper. They just want to be told what to do. And as one guy put it to a friend of ours, if I have enough to pay the rent and have a six-pack on the weekend, then I'm good. That's all he wanted to know.
That's majority of humanity, though. And I'm not saying, and I think we've got such. Anybody hears you say that, and they call you a Nazi if they're educated enough. It's a racial argument, right? Essentially, you're saying genetically, some people are just, and I'm not saying that people. I mean, and of course, history stands in contrast to that, because people would rise to levels of very, very high education from any sector of society. But it's more of a statistical fact. Like, it's not fatalist to say most people, in fact, just prefer to be, just as long as things can be basically hunky-dory for them, they're content. And I wonder if
it's based on you think that state of existence is okay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly. I think that's true, and I think that if that's what they want and have chosen to be capable of, and they can live a fulfilled life that way, great. That's just fine. Like the guy there's a shepherd around here. He's kind of like the last of the Mohicans of shepherds. I mean, there's, here, it's interesting here in Italy. It's still a dying breed. It's not like in civilized countries where, it's died 2 or 3 generations ago. It's still dying now. Certain, old trades and that thing. But you got this old shepherd. He drives around in his 1950 something Fiat Panda, or Fiat Cinquecento, instead of riding on a horse or a donkey. But he hangs out in the car, and he's got his 3 big white burly dogs who guide the sheep around. Not, very stereotypical shepherd type of person. Doesn't look too much going on between the ears, and he's okay with that. Always a little confused when he sees a human face. Not sure what to make of it. Most of his time is spent with sheep. And he kind of recognizes you, and he'll wave and kind of go on his way. And he seems happy in life, and that's just fine. Somebody needs to graze those sheep and do all of that, and that's where he finds his fulfillment doing it. And there's no problem with that. I'm not going to make him go get a master's degree in something, or even teach him how to, I don't know what. But you had a lot of, in a traditional society, you've got a lot of the other elements, singing, dancing, poetry, and all that, is also just part of peasant life. And that, there was more three-dimensional than what I think, your average person who just aspires to be a lunch lady, because then they can have, pay the bills and have a beer on the weekends.
Yeah. But even
because you've lost a real sense of society, because there's a difference now between, I just want to be able to kick back on the weekend, versus the traditional peasant commune, where they elect they're governed by self-autonomous collective or whatever, 2/3 majority for all external affairs and 3/4 majority for all internal affairs kind of situation, where they actually have festivity, and they celebrate, and they are connected to the land and the roots and their fathers and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Tolkien the perfect sort of the ideal Hobbit setting. They have festivity and they do things. The modern lower class person, it doesn't have higher aspirations because they're totally removed from any natural setting, any human setting.
Yeah.
And I think you've always had this stratification, but the stratification could be healthy when you had a healthy society. Now you don't have a healthy society, so you've got these withered brains, which aren't even being used as brains. They're automatons in a different way, functionaries. I mean, you get functionaries, and then you get, I don't know what, actually, les misérables. You get the actual miserable state, not just country folk.
Yeah, yeah. But I think it was a huge issue when Western culture, at least, moved to this idea that everybody needed to be elevated to this level that some people decided was the level that they should be at. I mean,
Right.
I totally agree with what you just said. I find that there are people that are satisfied with the job that they have and the state of life they have, and I don't see any need to have to like bring them up further, or even the idea of bringing them up further may be a bad model in and of itself. It's like Madame Bovary. Madame Bovary would be better than she actually is, and no, it's accept where you are, I suppose. But there is this elitism now, I think, which probably developed sometime. I probably would put it at the beginning of this century, where everybody had to be elevated to this level, and the more that I think about it, the more that I hate it. The more I hate that idea that they had to elevate some, and they also had to stratify more to look down on people that were not as elegant and tech savvy and pure of blood and all this, and so they look down on them with contempt. And it's maybe it's just because I've been reading about the eugenicists this whole fall. The whole progressive movement. I just get really pissed about it because it's just not. It's so wrong-headed, artificial, bad idea. It's permeated our education system in a very strange way in America. Because I think they think on the one hand, they think everybody should be elevated to such and such a level, right? And then at the same time, it's as though they treat kids like they can't do anything good, rather than recognizing that kids are good at this and some kids are good at that, and you help them along the way best you can. You say, well, everybody has to meet these standards, and if you don't, you're not good enough, or whatever it is, or your race is incapable of meeting the standards, blah blah blah.
Right.
My sister works down there in the reservation. Everybody should be educated in the same manner. They're quasi-Masonic. I mean, good school, but still have this idea that somehow the Masonic idea is sort of like the gold standard.
The grand level.
So they want everybody to meet that standard, and to teach these reservation kids all this great literature. These kids, they are peasants. They have lived a peasant life for eons, and they come in. They neither want to nor have the capacity to learn half the stuff that they're being asked to learn. So there's no way to actually put the Hillsdale curriculum into place with them. And is that, should they have it? Ought they to have it? Shouldn't they just be content with where they are? I kind of have a mind these days to say they should be content with where they are. So anyway,
the Scandinavians every once in a while have this resurgence of the idea of a folk school, right? The folk art school, whatever they call it, that you're just basic living connected to the land, carving craft, basic trades and crafts, and I mean peasant life stuff, based town life stuff, whichever, burger or country folk. You're learning the crafts of your people, the lore of your people, and that's good enough for you. And everybody can, in good Scandinavian fashion, it tends to be free, and and the idea is general cultural diffusion. And I mean that would be more appropriate. Is what is the story of your people? What are the basic things you need to know to do well in life and actually live a happy life? But what occurs to me is, you said something about the last century, and I would push back and say, first, at least since, you got two things that occur to me. One is you've got, since the mid 1800s. So the mid 1800s, globally, at least in European societies, including the Americas, you saw a massive, like in a sudden and global shift towards strong centralization. Right, the Prussians take over take over what had up until just recently been the Holy Roman Empire. Post Napoleon, right? Everything's got to get reworked. Some anarchists, and the Prussians take over Germany. Savoy, the House of Savoy takes over the whole continent of Italy, which is really three, anyway, very different nations. Conquers Italy,
Right.
tries to unify Italy on a strong central government. Germany's strong central government becomes Kingdom of Prussia. France is doing whatever France is doing. Who knows? Like they're in and out of different Restoration, Republic, stuff going on. But and then Americas, the war between the states and the United States, and what is now the United States, right? Again, strong centralization against local government. That becomes a thing. And in the Americas, you're having a strong influx of immigration at the same time. The solution, at least in the United States, becomes we need to enforce education in order to make sure that these people from shithole countries need to be taught the American way, because we don't want them undermining our project. So that's why we need to make, first through fifth grade or first through eighth grade mandatory to teach the values of our glorious republic. Right. That's the way they're talking about that, because these, Dagos, Wops, and Spics, Mix, whatever, are all, they're, and the most dangerous part, of course, is they're papists often, and they don't speak the language. So it's you send them to school so they can learn to speak the language, learn how to recite the creed, and get on board with the Masonic program of that version of liberal government.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing, don't undermine the system. Like that was when education became compulsory, and even in European countries, it's around the same time, compulsory education in order to form the new nation state identity.
Yep.
Right. It's not really through a benevolent, let's elevate society thing. At that point, it's exigencies of an absolutist nation state.
Yep.
And then I think what we see is like wedded to that then, or that's there and sort of grafted on to this pie in the sky enlightenment idealism that everybody should be Thomas Jefferson or something. This, we should all have that kind of education. The free liberal, it'd be great if, all these peasants could just be, everybody could be educated, the new literati and all that. Of course, who holds power in a system like that? The journalists who are thinking these thoughts and publishing these pamphlets, pamphleteers. And that's the modern media, right? That's the journalists. And so that's all kind of part of the same engine then, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And they all speak with the voice of Soderman, right? Very sweet words, but there's no substance to it. That maybe the whole project of this, I'm not against people learning things and universally bettering humanity. Those are great values, just like fraternity, equality, and liberty. But it's what you mean by them and how you set about trying to achieve them that becomes a problem. And I wonder if then the whole universal education has been off from the get-go that way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you go back to what Jefferson was suggesting with the universal education. I think if I remember right, I'd have to check it. I think he was suggesting universal education for everybody that was a landowner and was part of that middle to upper class. I don't think he would that universal education was for every coal miner and every dock worker that was in New York. I don't think he would have thought that. Now, he was far too
I don't think that would have occurred to him.
And I also think that we, of course, inherited the huge problem of having a bulk of slaves in the South, too, which presents another world of problem. And we also inherited the problem that we were, from the get-go, at loggerheads with the previous occupants of the land, and to put it mildly. And so, like here, for instance, the Ho-Chunk people were forcibly educated. There's a lot of merit in the fact that they were educated and brought into the modern world, but at the same time, it just steamrollered over everything of value that they had held dear for hundreds of years or more. And back then, you're right, before the 1860s, probably 1850s, 1860s, you had different groups educating the Catholic kids in Catholic reading and writing. And then you had the Protestant schools, the elitist Protestant schools. And people sent their kids to school in order to learn the basics, but not much more. So it was a real hodgepodge. But as soon as we began to streamline it and make it into this single monolithic entity, we ran into numerous problems that I think were just overlooked. And so now, it's only been 150 years since that project was begun, a little over 150, 170 years since that project was begun. So certainly time to fail. That's why I don't think it's reasonable that we're living through the failure of that project right now.
Oh, absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I would say, also that coupled with, and I think that it's part of a bigger fabric, or at least there are two things that are tied together, is the collapse of the nation state as the basic form of social organization. I mean, I think that was such a fragile, weak-minded thing to begin with, and it never really was successful, right? I mean, let's be honest about that. One can only look at the 20th century and the various, sure, we're still a nation state, even though we're an autocratic dictatorship, either of the National Socialist variety or the Marxist variety. Like those, it's always been a farce, and it's just a really bad way to organize human societies.
I agree, and it's shifting. It's shifting now to something very new, I think, which is the global state, and that's more terrifying than anything. The nation state had its advantages to some degree, I think, which is you're stronger, more resources, more travel ability, blah 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 blah. But really, you could have done the same thing if you were all, say, under Christendom, or under the Roman Empire. They could have done the same thing. That move to the nation state, which is really a bureaucratic thing, was I think it was a temporary state of existence, so to speak. It couldn't have lasted for too terribly long. What I'm really kind of amazed by is that we've been trying now since the 80s to revivify some sort of golden age in education, which I don't think ever really existed, especially in Catholic circles. No, Catholic circles here in America, like, oh, remember the golden age of the 1950s, and let's get back to that. And it never existed, buddy. There was never a golden age.
That was not, and that was a pretty shitty time, honestly. Like that is not the part I would pick to be the golden age.
Right. I know.
But for the American Catholic, that's when they gained sort of acceptance as human beings. And so therefore that's the golden. You got let out of your dog kennel and that's the golden age?
Yeah.
Like you're still living in, like, it's just not, that wasn't healthy.
No, but I think memory it tends to cloud the past frequently.
Yeah, it does. But it's also a convenient story to weave for people. If you were a opinion maker, if you were what does Michael Ende call it in the Neverending Story? The manipulators. If you were one of the manipulators, right, you'd pick a story like that. Like, yeah, that was a really great time when you finally succumbed to the way we want you to be. That's the golden age. We don't want you to actually go back to something different where you thought really differently. We want to come to the one where you've compromised your values enough. That's the time where we're going to tell you that is really the thing you should aim for.
There's another interesting thing to throw into this mix, I think, that we're facing right now. The rise of the Catholic fortune, on the one hand, wealthy Catholics, but also the rise, for lack of a better word, of groups like the Legionaries of Christ, who both those groups seem to work in tandem with each other. The one not recognizing that the other is a front for gangsters and criminals. And the money that's pouring into the attempt to revivify Catholic education, it's almost like it's just making it more bureaucratic and more one world progressive government than it was before anyway. It's irksome, because why don't you look at where the money is actually coming from? Why don't you look at the organizations that actually are founding these different schools? Maybe there's another agenda that they have. Um, it just irks me. It irks me.
Yeah.
I
But
guess
that's
I just
it. It's the walrus and the what was it in Alice in Wonderland, right? I
oh
mean,
well,
we're just oysters, man. We're all oysters following it along.
yeah. And I mean, I guess given the desperate situation of American education, it might be some sort of a salve, but in the long run, it's like, what are you really doing for young people? What are you really doing for human beings? Are you doing something that's beneficial in the long run, or the opposite of beneficial? Oh,
I think it's the opposite, and I think the thing has to like you can't fix what needs to break in order to grow.
that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah,
If you try and fix it, you're part of the problem,
yeah.
and that's a real hard saying, as they say. But that I think it sucks, but I think that that's what it is. Like the cement plaster had this the fake plaster cement has to come off the outside of the building if we're going to save the building's structure. Like
Yeah,
you got to
the house.
expose the raw stone first if you're going to
Yeah,
put real earthenware plaster up. Terracotta, like make it integrate. You can make it integrated again. I don't know what you say in English now, but fix it like it should be. You got to let the crap. You got to scrape the crap off first, or you got to let it break.
unless the Lord builds the house, the laborers build in vain.
Yeah,
Uh,
and the longer you try and hold that thing together, the more damage you're actually causing.
that raises something that my brother and I were just talking about, really intriguing to me in the last couple of weeks. I mean, it's always been
Yeah.
intriguing. It's a twofold issue. One is that I don't know whether this is American Catholicism or whether it's a universal human problem, but a superficial dealing with things that are of a spiritual nature. Okay, I think that American Catholicism generally thinks of spirituality as a sort of magic, in like a Harry Potter type of magic. And if you
Mm-hmm.
do the right words and do the right activities, you turn yourself around, you put your right foot in, you put your right foot out, you gain something from it. So like this universal exchange of
Yeah,
goods.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I think the majority of Catholics think that way in
I think
America.
that's absolutely true. I think it's especially the case in America because the nation it's a nation explicitly intended for the bourgeois class. Like that's the ideal citizen, right? Is the bourgeois gentleman rather than the nobility, the peasant, the priest, expressly denied. So the crafters of among the so-called founding fathers, they had that conversation in very, very explicit terms. Um, but I think I think that that's all over the case.
Mm.
That's it. How do I say it? That's global Catholicism globally on the whole is that way since the Council of Trent, or increasingly so,
Mm.
precisely because I would posit, precisely because of that bourgeois spirit shifting. I mean, speaking as an anthropologist, there's a shift in the religion, and it becomes a different kind of thing anthropologically. I'm not talking about dogma, not talking about the liturgy rubrics, but as a social cultural phenomenon, it takes on a different characteristic. Not
Yeah.
right away, but gradually from about that point, because and it's the same shift that Protestantism that gives birth to Protestantism that becomes that. It's the spread of that same kind of spirit. Both paths are following along that same trend. Um, in the West. So the West as a whole went down that path, went down that route. And I think you do see a shift. I mean, if you look at documents over time, the way people write about, the way they talk about, the way they ritually behave, or cut out actual ritual behavior in place of, especially after the era of revolutions, sentimentality replaces real, like, Roman piety.
Yeah.
But even before that, you get much more emphasis on commercial exchange, on essentially superstition.
Yep.
I mean, broadly speaking, like you said, if I just do these Harry Potter magic stuff, right? More of that kind of thing comes in the early modern period. The early modern period? Um, across the board than anything you saw in the Middle Ages or early Renaissance.
Mhm.
You know, it was a much more incarnated religion, much more focus on cult, actual like worship rituals, cultivating a quasi myst. I mean, everything was more like anything pulled from like the 13th, 14th century in most of Europe. If you were to, compare that to today, we'd all say, oh, that's like super mystical, even if it's the most mundane thing. By contrast, right? I mean, I think at that level of difference, as they're living in just a very different world, and sort of the pre, like Weber talks about this Protestant, what is it, economical sense? What's the word? The work ethic. That shift, the disenchantment. There's not a moment, but a period in time where that shift really happens, and it happens across the West. And I think you're absolutely right that's Catholicism in an accentuated way, American Catholicism, because of the particular history of America, of the United States as a culture. But I'd say predating that, like it's already on that trajectory because the whole West is already on that trajectory.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you don't see that same thing in like Ethiopian Christianity, which continues to be the Solomonic Empire until Haile Selassie's ousted by, well, certain acronym organizations, kept in a state of perpetual civil war. And I can't get my stinking coffee beans now. Personally wounded by this in my shallow, superficial way.
But no, it seems to be punctuated by a shallow, magical view of religion.
Mhm.
It seems to be punctuated with an idea that somehow this is all an exchange on an economic, and
Mhm.
it also seems to be punctuated by a radical intolerance for new ideas or questioning of things.
Yeah.
You think this way, that's orthodox, that's the way it should be. And don't ask those questions, or if you do ask those questions, page 261, there's your answer. The
Bingo.
manual.
And that there was a moment when that solution was proposed. I mean, that's after their name in the 16th century that sat down and said, "This is how we solve the new
Yeah.
heretics." The problem is people aren't educated enough. We need to educate them and teach them right doctrine with these handy manuals, and then they won't be heretics. I mean, it might surprise it didn't work. Look, that's an instruction manual that's gonna fix their problem when that ain't the problem.
But along those lines, it's thinking of human existence and human life and creation as a machine that
Exactly.
that's a huge problem. I think it's a huge problem.
Yeah. If I just put these cards into the right places, then the machine will work right.
And that that led to the second thing that my brother and I were talking about, which has always been difficult for both of us. When you've got too much in your head, it's like you have a hard time accepting certain things that other people have no problem with. And so he and I were talking about how it is that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, people were connected to earlier generations and earlier iterations of religious thought. At some point, I suppose you could time around the joining with Constantine, I don't know. But at some point, suddenly our religious experience sprang out of nowhere. It was an ex nihilo creation. It had no connection to earlier symbols and images and situations, and people before it were living in complete dark ignorance. Now we have the light. Rather than looking at people, like we've been talking about how it is that people 170,000 years ago could make some sort of artifact, like a bridge, for instance, and not have some religious experience. Because that's just not that's possible. They would have been doing writings and paintings on cavern walls and burying the dead and singing songs around campfires and really thinking about their relationship to the gods in general. And how is it that those people were wrong, and the last 2,000 years we've been right? That's startling.
I'm with you, but I want to say that's not the way that the medievals or the early Christians thought about or acted.
I know.
if we take a smattering of writings, we can find that kind of thinking. We can kind of read it into there. If you look at the way people actually behaved, early church, medieval Christianity, the Ethiopian South, the Orient, they don't behave towards local. It's not local, it's them, like it's their own ancestors. They don't have that attitude towards the past.
Yeah.
They integrate those same symbols, which is why Christianity in Malankara India or Malabar India looks really different from Frankish Christianity under the Carolingians.
Right.
Although the two of those look closer to each other than they do with anything you see in the West today.
Right. Right.
You get the incorporation of locals. Like, why are there a bajillion sacred wells in Ireland with all the same symbols and standing stones that their ancestors and the people before the Celts even got there put up and utilized? Because people just keep using it. It's a sacred site.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, okay, now we understand there's a god that's higher than the other being that was here. Maybe we need to exorcise that other being out.
Yep.
But these are still pretty stones. I'm going to keep using them. Like this well's still sacred. We all know that. We just have a better understanding of why it's sacred or something,
Yeah.
It's not until, I don't say like it's not. I think there's different periods in time where you get this, that's called a puritanical frenzy, where, somebody gets the bright idea that we got to purge all of that, and that happens from time to time, but it's really usually short-lived. But when, I don't know, I just gonna say the Jesuits got that idea, which is to say the church in the West got that idea at a certain point, and they just kept going with it. Like, that's this shift that they gutted all the, they literally, like, nothing post-Vatican II has got anything on the gutting of the churches in the 16th century.
Yeah.
Not by Henry VIII and his people, the stripping of the altars or whatever, tragic as that is, but the Romans themselves chiseling down the frescoes, whitewashing over the walls, getting rid of the rood screens, all of that stuff in the name of a new, broader, enlightened vision of Christianity. That's finally going to, that this is the problem. The reason there's Protestants is because blah, blah, blah. And all these other things are superstition. We're more enlightened and we need to teach people. And it's going to be helpful to teach people if we, basically do away with the way we worshiped God before, the way we did the sacraments before, and codify them in one great central, one council to rule them all, and in the midst of Trent bind them or something. I mean, it's a bit over dramatic about one particular council in the West, but that's symbolic of this shift. And I think it's something more along those, like that period of history where you start to see a big shift.
Yeah.
That says these people were crazy and they lived in the darkness and they were wrong. And that's where you get the first inklings of an idea that there were dark ages and now we're enlightened or something. It's not framed quite in that way until obviously a couple centuries later with the Enlightenment, but I think it's not like when Christianity, the Roman Empire becomes Christianized, that somehow everything before was wrong and backwards. I think that's reading a post-Renaissance interpretation of things into the way people actually behaved. Because I mean that's the biggest criticism that the Protestants and the Jesuit reformers, right? So there's a Roman Catholic Church TM, that comes after the 1600s, and the Protestant things. Their biggest criticism about the other stuff is it's backwards, superstitious, and half pagan.
Yeah. And so by the time that this nation came on the scene, it had been going on for quite some time. This attitude. Yeah. And now Benjamin and I were thinking, how does one who doesn't have that sensibility or who knows more than your average bear, how do you survive in the modern era? You just keep your trap shut, I guess, and try to avoid calumny as much as possible, I suppose.
Maybe. I don't know.
I don't know either because I know that if
I
you
think it's
proclaim something of ancient religion or culture as a reality, all of a sudden you're a new ager.
yeah.
You're a freaky hippie or you're an apostate or whatever it is. No, I'm just stating something for goodness sakes. You know, I remember I put something up because I was just musing on this mathematical thing, if nothing else. And somebody immediately got there and told me how I didn't understand mathematics and I was just doing magic and a typical liberal arts major and blah, blah, blah. And I was kind of stunned by this vitriol of this guy. It's just like,
Hmm.
you're a Christian, aren't you? I guess. Wow. How about that? And the conclusion that Benjamin and I came to is it's hard to figure out how else you're supposed to live. Because in the West, as T.S. Eliot said, you're a Christian. But there's a lot there that it's highly objectionable. It's frustrating,
Hmm.
objectionable. So I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to
I
do with
mean,
it. And maybe I'm just in a jaded spot too, because I've seen education kind of be a failure, and I've seen so much of Christianity becoming a failure, American Christianity becoming a failure. And I just find myself thinking I just want to have my own farmstead and live off the land, and that's it.
there are people that take that option, that take that path. One who I greatly respect and be like, he's the last of the people you'd expect to be a Grizzly Adams. Um, but he opted to get out of education and go do that too, um, to have a farmstead because this stuff is just messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole modern project is a failure, not a failure that needs fixing, but something that was really toxic to be in the first place. Um,
Right.
so it's just good to get away from it because there's Katie and I talking about a lot about this lately. It's come up in various conversations with people
Mm.
about how well something's better than nothing. So yeah, not if that something is toxic though. Like no poison, no food. Having no food is better than having poisoned food. You know, like no critters in your bed. Sleeping alone in your bed is better than having an asp in your bed with you. Right? Hashtag Cleopatra. Like
Yeah.
it's if something is toxic, like actually corrosively toxic, it's best to stay away from it, even if it means you do without something.
Yeah. That's
Um,
that's true.
you know, how do we apply that? Gosh, that's where it gets messy.
Yeah.
Um, but I think this is what Tolkien is writing about and probably feels very deeply himself. It's the Great War and all this shit, and industrialism and all that stuff. Like, I can't, he's a, he's somebody, jaded, other people came out messed up properly. Like we've talked about, he somehow, is able to like write beautiful things instead of just, his life good down the drain. But, um, you mentioned in some of our exchanges earlier about Tolkien's Dark Ages, like Dark Ages of Middle Earth and the Dark Ages we're living in now. I think is precisely what most of the Silmarillion is about. Large chunks of it, at any rate. You got these elves who maybe a lot of them, including Galadriel, right? Your hands got a little dirty, and the world's kind of thrown over into the hands of this messed up Feanorian, vengeance thing. Their oath and the great kingdoms are falling apart. The Valar pretty much are just hanging out over in Valinor. They're holding back. What is a guy to do? You know, um, and different. I think that many of the different characters with Turgon who goes and finds Gondolin, and then the fall of Gondolin. You've got Arundel and Elwing who go try and beseech the god. They step into the blessed realm to be, on behalf of humanity and men and elves, but in fact humanity, let's just say. You got, who is it? The one hand Baron and Luthien fighting the Dark Lord. At the end of it all, anyway, what did they end up doing? Going and living a kind of a married hermetical life off in some, the mouth of the river somewhere, far away from it all, because You just can't fix that stuff. It's so far corrupted. It has to be in the hands of God to grant new growth to. And I mean, it's like it just kind of it comes to me now as I'm saying, like Katie and I have been reading a lot of the church fathers, a lot of the monastic, the ascetics of the desert.
Yeah.
And, one of the themes throughout monastic literature I mean, forever, right? Whether it's Anthony in the year 200 something, or whether it's, 800 years later, some Carthusian hermit or some such, like the idea is that it's a great deception of arrogance to think that we actually have control, like that things that the world needs us to do something, or that we're even capable of doing anything.
Yes.
When I recognize my own frailness and ineptitude, I'm more likely statistically to do more harm than good if I go try and fix something.
Oh yeah.
What I need to do is abandon myself to the hands of God and let him fix it and just do whatever he tells me to.
This is
You know,
really interesting. You should bring this up. One of the things I had wanted to talk about, and maybe we're already talking about it. I don't know if you want this published or not. I was listening to a talk about Frank Herbert versus J.R.R. Tolkien, right?
ah,
And apparently, and you've read Dune. You're familiar with Dune.
yeah, basic parts
Okay,
of it. Yeah, not the whole
so
series, but
Tolkien read that novel. Apparently, I did not know this.
that
He read,
sounds familiar. I should mention it.
and he hated it.
Yeah,
He hated it. And the speculation in this talk was primarily that he hated it for different reasons, but the main reason is what Frank Herbert was saying about human nature, different from what Tolkien was saying about human nature. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I partially agree with Tolkien. I think that Frank Herbert is saying something radically different, and I don't think he's saying something correct about human nature. But that being said, I do think Frank Herbert's work, especially the first one, is a very good cautionary tale about what happens when somebody tries to do something about the problem without recourse to a spiritual life at all. Frank
right.
Herbert, he's not religious. He's an atheist, or Buddhist actually, but he's I guess Buddhist atheist, whatever that entails.
Right.
And he saw that humanity projected into the future would develop in only this way, this sort of fighting with our machines eventually, and developing our talents to become almost bureaucratic in our distinctions between different clannish groups. But also, I think he saw that the attempt to seize power and fix everything necessarily falls into an autocracy, and a violent one at that. And that's what happens with Paul Atreides. I think he's
Right.
absolutely right as far as anybody trying to do that Machiavellian thing of uniting Italy, whatever it is. The minute you do that, I think you run into this necessity of doing awful things and doing things that you think are correct when really they're very ill-headed. I think
Right.
Tolkien was aware of that, but I think he was saying that the tonic or corrective to that is to do small things in a great way, to follow the will of Iluvatar in this case, but to follow the will
Right.
of God, follow one's own desire to become the Lord of the Ring. So it's both are valuable novels, but it's interesting how different the claim is on human nature. And though I value both, I think Tolkien has a greater statement about this. I also did not know that he was going to be writing a sequel to Lord of the Rings. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
I didn't know
It
that.
got dark, and he kind of like, I'm getting too old for this stuff anyway. And it's not, if we're going to be honest, yeah, things, he writes a decline and it gets like creepy.
Yeah.
And
Apparently,
that's,
it got very political. I think he said too. He didn't want to go into
yeah,
this sort of and
yeah.
I tough not to go into it because that's probably the 1950s or 60s when hard not to have some opinion on what was going on. But he project never developed it. His son never developed it either, despite the fact that Christopher developed many other works. I don't know if
Exactly.
see it.
Yeah. I think, I mean, also, I think pulling back from it, if I could, I would call it projecting on to Tolkien. Um, when you start to see, if you for somebody who's as clear-sighted as he was, many people are, a few people, a handful of people in every generation are clear-sighted, pretty clear-sighted about where things are going, right? Where things are headed. Jonathan Swift, by the way, we read through Gulliver's Travels, some really crazy stuff. They're like, oh my God, it's exactly how it turned out.
Yes.
But the you get a point where you start to realize you put the pen to paper and the words that are coming out onto the page from the intuitions in your head, they become words on the page. You look at them, you're like, look, it's just going to happen. It's better if I don't say it ahead of time because that's somehow adding to the evil, right? Like, better not to speak it because it's coming anyway.
Yeah.
In some sense, not because it's coming anyway, but I don't know how to say, like, it's just too scary to put down into words like, hey, there's a big dragon coming.
Maybe the another way to put it is that if you know it's happening, then giving voice to it only contributes to the despair and ruin of people in the future. Whereas
Yes.
what we really need is to have some vision of how to overcome that, how to succeed through that or flourish. Maybe.
Exactly. The solution is not to call the goblins nasty names, but to start weaving a counterspell.
Hmm.
And I think that's seems to me what if I take the content of Tolkien's work overall, and I think Christopher, this is largely in the hands of his son, Christopher Tolkien, who pieces together, right, the estate of his father to publish all these most of the works that we know, right? They were notes and scraps of stuff on the professor's desk that his son put together and published as complete books. He made a lot of decisions. And I think what he's doing is providing the world with the lights, not showing how dark the darkness can get. And I think that's probably at the background of Tolkien's beef with some of these other stories, is that they're absolutely correct in how things are going to play out.
Yeah.
But that's not what we need right now.
Yeah.
You need some cautionary things, but the biggest thing you need then is the File of Galadriel, because that's the only thing that's going to get you out of Shelob's lair, not a treatise on spice.
Right. And that's I know Joseph Campbell had flaws, but one of the things he said over and over again was we have to retell the same story, which is the idea that the hero can actually do this great accomplishment. And we retell that story over and over again because that's what we need to tell. It's you think about the story of Turin Turambar and all that awfulness that goes into that story.
Right.
Which, if that were all there were, God help us. You marry your sister, you get you get destroyed by a dragon, and all this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, that's a downer, and there's nothing else. That's all there is. Good night. The stories that are the great stories that we retell are stories like Beowulf, where you actually can overcome just by dying. You can overcome something and horrible and threatening. But to tell stories like and to be honest, even as far as the movie Alien, which some people may say is a complete downer of a movie, but no, it kind of tells the story of Beowulf again. The ability to overcome that horrible dragon on board the ship. It's a same story. But then you go to Alien 3, if you're following with me here, where you don't overcome the alien. They do take over. You do get destroyed. Everything that you love gets ruined. That's a vision of darkness and awfulness. And how does that help anybody get through the awfulness and darkness that we know is inevitably going to happen? It doesn't, right? It doesn't at all.
No, that's exactly right.
I wonder if it's ever been different, to be honest. I don't know. I don't know if there are enough existing stories of just, shit happens and then we die, to be able to say, yeah, they were thinking about this way back when. the stories that we have primarily seem to be stories of accomplishment and being able to overcome awfulness, and despite all of our misgivings, that seems to, or even stories of defeat, for instance, like the Lancelot story. In his defeat, he learns what he's supposed to learn. That's an accomplishment than a failure.
Exactly.
I can't think of many stories where it's just ruin after ruin after ruin, unless it's comic, you know.
Right.
So,
but then it's meant to be comic.
Yeah.
Right.
That's an
existential slapstick.
Yeah, existential slapstick. Yeah, right. I think too that some of the modern writers, like you mentioned earlier, they seem to be dwelling primarily on the ruin and destruction bit. I think about Dan Brown, for instance, and all of his crappy works, you know, or who's the one who wrote Elijah and Windswept House, you know, that fella, predicting all these horrible things and the corruption within the church and the ruination of Western civilization. Well, you know, it's all true, but but how does the story that doesn't actually overcome it or succeed in or fixing it, how does it help at all? It's just depressing.
It is, and it's damaging because it gives because stories are powerful. And so if you describe what's happening, if you take the facts, the data points of what's happening, and you weave a story of darkness, you're literally casting a dark enchantment, right? You're effectively a necromancer.
Right.
And you know, whether or not you think you're warning people, you're a necromancer. Everybody can see what's happening. Being able to say, and this is just part of a different story, casts a counterspell and makes it shifts you end up living in a very different reality. Like, you can change reality by the collective stories that we tell about what's going on.
Right.
If we say everything's hunky-dory and it's not, we're all just marching right off the cliff. We're a bunch of lemmings. But if we say everything is death and darkness and it's all going to hell in a handbasket, look at how terrible things are, you're only doubling down on the negative effects of what's already happening because you're weaving a dark spell. It's like Denethor staring into his palantir and seeing all the terrible things. You're seeing exactly what Sauron wants you to see. Just like, and this was a really cool insight that I heard. Those folks on the Amon Sul podcast talking about Turin Turambar, that the whole story of Turin, the Arnihin Hurin, the children of Hurin, it's dark. Like, what's going on? Like, Tolkien's this guy of hope. What's with all this whole everything goes just disastrously? Is that it's the story that's told by Hurin. That's what Hurin saw when he was in Morgoth's chair, when Morgoth tied him down and said, "You're going to see everything that happens." The narrative, what is it? The narrative perspective of the narrator is Morgoth.
Yeah.
Like, that's what the world looks like when you're looking through Morgoth glasses.
Yeah. Morgoth goggles. Yeah, that's a very good insight. And although I value works like 1984, for instance, or what's the other, Fahrenheit 451, you know, these are powerful works, but they aren't the works that people have gravitated towards. You know, really remarkable that people gravitated towards Harry Potter, but that Harry Potter told the story of being able to triumph over that darkness, you know, and not having it being the rule for everybody. My wife was reading through Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
And he was, one of the things Frankl points out, people that survived those concentration camps were normally the people, not the tough people and not the people that were constantly thinking about home and getting home. They were people that had some sort of vision of what goodness really was. That's quite stark, but it makes sense when you think about how this is what's always gotten humanity through the awfulness of being alive at all, is the vision of beauty and goodness and greatness and triumph. It's not telling horrible, dark, Cthulhu-based stories. No. It's rather being able to suggest that, yeah, you know, this sucks, but we can get through it. And even if we don't get through it, there's something greater that we are destined for. That's That's an important thing to note, I think,
It
especially.
is, and I think that's that moment in Mordor where Sam looks up and the clouds
Yeah,
part for a second. He sees a star, and he
yeah,
realizes all of a sudden, no, there's a whole world of stars up there. Just because the clouds are covering it, even if I die here, which I probably am before tomorrow, you know, there's still like there's realms where the darkness can't touch,
yeah,
and that's a very different kind of story to be telling yourself, to be living.
yeah. We just watched, my son and I, just for larks, we watched that awful Rankin Bass Return of the King that came out in the
Oh yes,
horrible piece of work. But it was laughable. We had a fun time laughing at it. But it did occur to me, my dad used to say such things were blasphemous. And the National parody that came out right after the publication trilogy called Board of the Rings. And he said these were blasphemous works. And I've always been kind of intrigued by that statement. How are those things blasphemous? Well, it makes perfect sense. If what you're talking about is you're talking about a work that creates a spell of hope and joy and salvation, really, to make something obscene out of it is a form of blasphemy.
Yeah.
It's no different, really, in some ways than Piss Christ, or the Angels in America. That. And I think we see far too much blasphemy right now. We see far too much blasphemy, and not as much of the retelling of the great story of salvation, which we need.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Lassiter.
Well, however you fare, to your areas receive you at your journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.